Chapter 21 of The Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessie. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming, Chapter 21. What was behind the mask? The cowering form rose up, but seeing who it was, sank down again with its face grovelling in the dust, and with another prolonged, moaning cry. "Madame Masque!" he said wonderingly. "What is this?" He bent to raise her, but with a sort of scream she held out her arms to keep him back. "No! No! No! Touch me not! Hate me! Kill me! I have murdered your friend." Sir Norman recoiled as if from a deadly serpent. "Murdered him? Madame, in heaven's name, what have you said?" "Oh, I have not stabbed him or poisoned him or shot him, but I am his murderer nevertheless," she wailed, writhing in a sort of gnawing inward torture. "Madame, I do not understand you at all. Surely you are raving when you talk like this?" Still moaning on the edge of the plague pit, she half rose up, with both hands clasped tightly over her heart, as if she would have held back from all human ken the anguish that was destroying her. "No, no, I am not mad! Pray heaven I were! Oh, that they had strangled me in the first hour of my birth as they would a viper, rather than I should have lived through all this life of misery and guilt to end it by this last, worst crime of all!" Sir Norman stood and looked at her still with a dazed expression. He knew well enough whose murderer she called herself, but why she did so, or how she could possibly bring about his death, was a mystery altogether too deep for him to solve. "Madame, compose yourself, I beseech you, and tell me what you mean. It is to my friend, Ormistan, you allude, is it not?" "Yes, yes! Surely you need not ask." "I know that he is dead, and buried in this horrible place. But why you should accuse yourself of murdering him, I confess I do not know." "Then you shall!" she cried passionately. "And you will wonder at it no longer. You are the last one to whom the revelation can ever be made on earth; and now that my hours are numbered, it matters little whether it is told or not. Was it not you who first found him dead?" "It was I, yes. And how he came to his end I have been puzzling myself in vain to discover ever since." She rose up, drew herself to her full majestic height, and looked at him with a terrible glance. "Shall I tell you?" "You have had no hand in it," he answered, with a cold chill at the tone and look, "for he loved you." "I have had a hand in it. I alone have been the cause of it. But for me, he would be living still." "Madame!" exclaimed Sir Norman in horror. "You need not look as if you thought me mad, for I tell you it is heaven's truth. You say right, he loved me, but for that love he would be living now." "You speak in riddles which I cannot read. How could that love have caused his death, since his dearest wishes were to be granted to-night?" "He told you that, did he?" "He did. He told me you were to remove your mask, and if, on seeing you, he still loved you, you were to be his wife." "Then woe to him for ever having extorted such a promise from me! Oh, I warned him again and again and again. I told him how it would be. I begged him to desist. But no, he was blind, he was mad, he would rush on his own doom. I fulfilled my promise, and behold the result!" She pointed with a frantic gesture to the plague pit, and wrung her beautiful hands with the same moaning of anguish. "Do I hear aright?" said Sir Norman, looking at her, and really doubting if his ears had not deceived him. "Do you mean to say that, in keeping your word and showing him your face, you have caused his death?" "I do. I had warned him of it before. I told him there were sights too horrible to look on and live, but nothing would convince him. Oh, why was the curse of life ever bestowed upon such a hideous thing as I?" Sir Norman gazed at her in a state of hopeless bewilderment. He had thought, from the moment he saw her first, that there was something wrong with her brain to make her act in such a mysterious, eccentric sort of way, but he had never positively thought her so far gone as this. In his own mind he set her down now as being mad as a March hare, and accordingly answered in that soothing tone people use to imbeciles. "My dear Madame Masque, pray do not excite yourself, or say such dreadful things. I am sure you would not wilfully cause the death of any one, much less that of one who loved you as he did." La Masque broke into a wild laugh, almost worse to hear than her former despairing moans. "The man thinks me mad! He will not believe unless he sees and knows for himself. Perhaps you too, Sir Norman Kingsley," she cried, changing into sudden fierceness, "would like to see the face behind this mask, would like to see what has slain your friend, and share his fate?" "Certainly," said Sir Norman, "I should like to see it, and I think I may safely promise not to die from the effects. But surely, madame, you deceive yourself. No face, however ugly, even supposing you to possess such a one, could produce such dismay as to cause death." "You shall see." She was looking down into the plague pit, standing so close to its cracking edge that Sir Norman's blood ran cold in the momentary expectation to see her slip and fall headlong in. Her voice was less fierce and less wild, but her hands were still clasped tightly over her heart, as if to ease the unutterable pain there. Suddenly she looked up and said, in an altered tone: "You have lost Leoline?" "And found her again. She is in the power of one Count L'Estrange." "And if in his power, pray, how have you found her?" "Because we are both to meet in her presence within this very hour, and she is to decide between us." "Has Count L'Estrange promised you this?" "He has." "And you have no doubt what her decision will be?" "Not the slightest." "How came you to know she was carried off by this count?" "He confessed it himself." "Voluntarily?" "No. I taxed him with it, and he owned to the deed; but he voluntarily promised to take me to her and abide by her decision." "Extraordinary!" said La Masque, as if to herself. "Whimsically as he is, I scarcely expected he would give her up so easily as this." "Then you know him, madame?" said Sir Norman pointedly. "There are few things I do not know, and rare are the disguises I cannot penetrate. So you have discovered it too?" "No, madame, my eyes were not sharp enough, nor had I sufficient cleverness even for that. It was Hubert, the Earl of Rochester's page, who told me who he was." "Ah, the page!" said La Masque quickly. "You have then been speaking to him? What do you think of his resemblance to Leoline?" "I think it is the most astonishing resemblance I ever saw. But he is not the only one who bears Leoline's face." "And the other is?" "The other is she whom you sent me to see in the old ruins. Madame, I wish you would tell me the secret of this wonderful likeness, for I am certain you know, and I am equally certain it is not accidental." "You are right. Leoline knows already, for with the presentiment that my end was near, I visited her when you left, and gave her her whole history in writing. The explanation is simple enough. Leoline, Miranda, and Hubert are sisters and brother. Some misty idea that such was the case had been struggling through Sir Norman's slow mind, unformed and without shape, ever since he had seen the trio. Therefore he was not the least astonished when he heard the fact announced. Only in one thing he was a little disappointed. "Then Hubert is really a boy?" he said, half dejectedly. "Certainly he is. What did you take him to be?" "Why, I thought that is, I do not know," said Sir Norman, quite blushing at being guilty of so much romance, "but that he was a woman in disguise. You see, he is so handsome, and looks so much like Leoline, that I could not help thinking so." "He is Leoline's twin brother, that accounts for it. When does she become your wife?" "This very morning, God willing," said Sir Norman, fervently. "Amen, and may her life and yours be long and happy. What becomes of the rest?" "Since Hubert is her brother, he shall come with us if he will. As for the other, she, alas, is dead." "Dead!" cried La Masque. "How? When? She was living to-night." "True, she died of a wound." "A wound? Surely not given by the dwarf's hand?" "No, no, it was quite accidental. But since you know so much of the dwarf, perhaps you also know he is now the king's prisoner?" "I did not know it, but I surmised as much when I discovered that you and Count L'Estrange, followed by such a body of men, visited the ruin. Well, his career has been long and dark enough, and even the plague seems to spare him for the executioner." "And so the poor mock queen is dead?" "Well, her sister will not long survive her." "Good heavens, madame!" cried Sir Norman, aghast. "You do not mean to say that Leoline is going to die?" "Oh, no! I hope Leoline has a long and happy life before her. But the wretched, guilty sister I mean, is myself; for I, too, Sir Norman, am her sister." At this new disclosure Sir Norman stood perfectly petrified, and La Masque, looking down at the dreadful place at her feet, went rapidly on: "Alas, and alas, that it should be so, but it is the direful truth. We bear the same name, we had the same father, and yet I have been the curse and bane of their lives." "And Leoline knows this?" "She never knew it until this night, or any one else alive; and no one should know it now, were not my ghastly life ending. I prayed her to forgive me for the wrong I have done her, and she may, for she is gentle and good. But when shall I be able to forgive myself?" The sharp pain in her voice jarred on Sir Norman's ear and heart, and to get rid of its dreary echo, he hurriedly asked: "You say you bear the same name. May I ask what name that is?" "It is one, Sir Norman Kingsley, before which your own ancient title pales. We are Montmorency, and in our veins runs the proudest blood in France." "Then Leoline is French, and of noble birth?" said Sir Norman, with a thrill of pleasure. "I loved her for herself alone, and would have wedded her had she been the child of a beggar, but I rejoice to hear this, nevertheless. Her father, then, bore a title?" "Her father was the Marquis de Montmorency, but Leoline's mother and mine were not the same. Had they been, the lives of all four might have been very different. But it is too late to lament that now. My mother had no gentle blood in her veins, as Leoline's had, for she was but a fisherman's daughter, torn from her home and married by force. Neither did she love my father, notwithstanding his youth, rank, and passionate love for her, for she was betrothed to another bourgeois like herself. For his sake she refused even the title of marchioness offered her in the moment of youthful and ardent passion, and clung with deathless truth to her fisher lover. The blood of the Montmorency is fierce and hot, and brooks no opposition. Sir Norman thought of Miranda, and inwardly owned that that was a fact. And the Marquis, in his jealous wrath, both hated and loved her at the same time, and vowed deadly vengeance against her bourgeois lover. That vow he kept. The young fisherman was found one morning at his lady love's door without a hat, and the bleeding trunk told no tales. Of course, for a while she was distracted and so on. But when the first shock of her grief was over, my father carried her off and forcibly made her his wife. Fierce hatred, I told you, was mingled with his fierce love, and before the honeymoon was over it began to break out. One night, in a fit of jealous passion to which he was addicted, he led her into a room she had never before been permitted to enter, showed her a grinning human skull, and told her it was her lover's. In his cruel exultation he confessed all: how he had caused him to be murdered, his head severed from the body, and brought here to punish her some day for her obstinate refusal to love him. Up to this time she had been quiet and passive, bearing her fate with a sort of dumb resignation. But now a spirit of vengeance, fiercer and more terrible than his own, began to kindle within her, and, kneeling down before the ghastly thing, she breathed a wish, a prayer, to the avenging Jehovah, so unutterably horrible that even her husband had to fly with curdling blood from the room. That dreadful prayer was heard, that wish fulfilled in me. But long before I looked on the light of day, that frantic woman had repented of the awful deed she had done. Repentance came too late, the sin of the father was visited on the child, and on the mother too, for the moment her eyes fell upon me, she became a raving maniac, and died before the first day of my life had ended. Nurse and physician fled at the sight of me, but my father, though thrilling with horror, bore the shock and bowed to the retributive justice of the angry deity she had invoked. His whole life, his whole nature changed from that hour, and kneeling beside my dead mother, as he afterward told me, he vowed before high heaven to cherish and love me even as though I had not been the ghastly creature I was. The physician he bound by a terrible oath to silence. The nurse he forced back, and in spite of her disgust and abhorrence, compelled her to nurse and care for me. The dead was buried out of sight, and we had rooms in a distant part of the house, which no one ever entered but my father and the nurse. Though set apart from my birth as something accursed, I had the intellect and capacity of, yes, far greater intellect and capacity than most children, and as years passed by, my father, true to his vow, became himself my tutor and companion. He did not love me, that was an utter impossibility, but time so blunts the edge of all things that even the nurse became reconciled to me, and my father could scarcely do less than a stranger. So I was cared for and instructed and educated, and knowing not what a monstrosity I was, I loved them both ardently and lived on happily enough in my splendid prison for my first 10 years in this world. Then came a change. My nurse died, and it became clear that I must quit my solitary life and see the sort of world I lived in. So my father, seeing all this, sat down in the twilight one night beside me, and told me the story of my own hideousness. I was but a child then, and it is many and many years ago. But this gray summer morning I feel what I felt then as vividly as I did at the time. I had not learned the great lesson of life then. Endurance, I have scarcely learned it yet, or I should bear life's burden longer. But that first night's despair has darkened my whole after life. For weeks I would not listen to my father's proposal, to hide what would send all the world from me in loathing behind a mask. But I came to my senses at last, and from that day to the present, more days than either you or I would care to count, it has not been 1 hour altogether off my face. I was the wonder and talk of Paris when I did appear, and most of the surmises were wild and wide of the mark, some even going so far as to say it was all owing to my wonderful, unheard of beauty that I was thus mysteriously concealed from view. I had a soft voice and a tolerable shape, and upon this, I presume, they founded the affirmation. But my father and I kept our own counsel, and let them say what they listed. I had never been named as other children are, but they called me La Masque now. I had masters and professors without end, and studied astronomy and astrology and the mystic lore of the old Egyptians, and became noted as a prodigy and a wonder and a miracle of learning far and near. The arts used to discover the mystery and make me unmask were innumerable and almost incredible, but I baffled them all, and began, after a time, rather to enjoy the sensation I created than otherwise. There was one in particular, possessed of even more devouring curiosity than the rest, a certain young countess of miraculous beauty, whom I need not describe, since you have her very image in Leoline. The Marquis de Montmorency, of a somewhat inflammable nature, loved her almost as much as he had done my mother, and she accepted him, and they were married. She may have loved him, I see no reason why she should not, but still to this day I think it was more to discover the secret of La Masque than from any other cause. I loved my beautiful new mother too well to let her find it out, although from the day she entered our house as a bride until that on which she lay on her deathbed, her whole aim, day and night, was its discovery. There seemed to be a fatality about my father's wives, for the beautiful Honorine lived scarcely longer than her predecessor, and she died, leaving 3 children, all born at one time. You know them well, and one of them you love. To my care she entrusted them on her deathbed, and she could have scarcely entrusted them to worse. For though I liked her, I most decidedly disliked them. They were lovely children, their lovely mother's image, and they were named Hubert, Leoline, and Honorine, or as you knew her, Miranda. Even my father did not seem to care for them much, not even as much as he cared for me, and when he lay on his deathbed, 1 year later, I was left, young as I was, their sole guardian and trustee of all his wealth. That wealth was not fairly divided, 1/2 being left to me and the other half to be shared equally between them. But in my wicked ambition I was not satisfied even with that. Some of my father's fierce and cruel nature I inherited, and I resolved to be clear of these 3 stumbling blocks and recompense myself for my other misfortunes by every indulgence boundless riches could bestow. So secretly and in the night I left my home with an old and trusty servant, known to you as Prudence, and my unfortunate little brother and sisters. Strange to say, Prudence was attached to one of them, and to neither of the rest. That one was Leoline, whom she resolved to keep and care for, and neither she nor I minded what became of the other two. From Paris we went to Dijon, where we dropped Hubert into the turn at the convent door with his name attached, and left him where he would be well taken care of and no questions asked. With the other two we started for Calais en route for England, and there Prudence got rid of Honorine in a singular manner. A packet was about starting for the island of our destination, and she saw a strange-looking little man carrying his luggage from the wharf into a boat. She had the infant in her arms, having carried it out for the identical purpose of getting rid of it, and, without more ado, she laid it down, unseen, among boxes and bundles, and, like Hagar, stood afar off to see what became of it. That ugly little man was the dwarf, and his amazement on finding it among his goods and chattels you may imagine. But he kept it notwithstanding, though why is best known to himself. A few weeks after that we two came over, and Prudence took up her residence in a quiet village a long way from London. Thus you see, Sir Norman, how it comes about that we are so related, and the wrong I have done them all. "You have indeed," said Sir Norman gravely, having listened, much shocked and displeased, at this open confession. "And to one of them it is beyond our power to atone. Do you know the life of misery to which she has been assigned?" "I know it all, and have repented for it in my own heart in dust and ashes. Even I, unlike all other earthly creatures as I am, have a conscience, and it has given me no rest night or day since. From that hour I have never lost sight of them. Every sorrow they have undergone has been known to me and added to my own. And yet I could not, or would not, undo what I had done. Leoline knows all now, and she will tell Hubert, since destiny has brought them together. And whether they will forgive me, I know not. But yet they might, for they have long and happy lives before them, and we can forgive everything to the dead." "But you are not dead," said Sir Norman, "and there is repentance and pardon for all. Much as you have wronged them, they will forgive you, and Heaven is not less merciful than they." "They may, for I have striven to atone. In my house there are proofs and papers that will put them in possession of all, and more than all, they have lost. But life is a burden of torture I will bear no longer. The death of him who died for me this night is the crowning tragedy of my miserable life; and if my hour were not at hand, I should not have told you this. But you have not told me the fearful cause of so much guilt and suffering. What is behind that mask?" "Would you too see," she asked in a terrible voice, "and die?" "I have told you it is not in my nature to die easily, and it is something far stronger than mere curiosity makes me ask." "Be it so. The sky is growing red with day dawn, and I shall never see the sun rise more, for I am already plague struck." That sweetest of all voices ceased. The white hands removed the mask and the floating coils of hair, and revealed to Sir Norman's horror-struck gaze the grisly face and head, and the hollow eye sockets, the grinning mouth and fleshless cheeks of a skeleton. He saw it but for one fearful instant. The next she had thrown up both arms, and leaped headlong into the loathly plague pit. He saw her for a second or two, heaving and writhing in the putrid heap. And then the strong man reeled and fell with his face on the ground, not feigning, but sick unto death. Of all the dreadful things he had witnessed that night, there was nothing so dreadful as this. Of all the horror he had felt before, there was none to equal what he felt now. In his momentary delirium, it seemed to him she was reaching her arms of bone up to drag him in, and that the skeleton face was grinning at him on the edge of the awful pit. And covering his eyes with his hands, he sprang up and fled away. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming. Chapter 22. Day Dawn. All this time the attendant George had been sitting very much at his ease on horseback, looking after Sir Norman's charger, and admiring the beauties of sunrise. He had seen Sir Norman in conversation with a strange female, and, not much liking his near proximity to the plague pit, was rather impatient for it to come to an end. But when he saw the tragic manner in which it did end, his consternation was beyond all bounds. Sir Norman, in his horrified flight, would have fairly passed him unnoticed, had not George arrested him by a loud shout. "I beg your pardon, Sir Norman," he exclaimed, as that gentleman turned his distracted face, "but it seems to me you are running away. Here is your horse, and allow me to say, unless we hurry, we'll scarcely reach the Count by sunrise." Sir Norman leaned against his horse, and shaded his eyes with his hand, shuddering like one in an ague. "Why did that woman leap into the pig pit?" inquired George, looking at him curiously. "Was it not the sorceress La Masque?" "Yes, yes, do not ask me any questions now," replied Sir Norman, in a smothered voice, and with an impatient wave of his hand. "Whatever you please, sir," said George, with the flippancy of his class, "but still I must repeat, if you do not mount instantly, we will be late, and my master the Count is not one who brooks delay." The young knight vaulted into the saddle without word, and started off at a breakneck pace into the city. George, almost unable to keep up with him, followed instead of leading, rather sceptical in his own mind whether he were not riding after a moon-struck lunatic. Once or twice he shouted out a sharp-toned inquiry as to whether he knew where he was going, and that they were taking the wrong way altogether, to all of which Sir Norman deigned not the slightest reply, but rode more and more recklessly on. There were but few people abroad at that hour. Indeed, for that matter, the streets of London in the dismal summer of 1665 were, comparatively speaking, always deserted, and the few now wending their way homeward were tired physicians and plague nurses from the hospitals, and several hardy country folks, with more love of lucre than fear of death, bending their steps with produce to the market-place. These people, sleepy and pallid in the grey haze of daylight, stared in astonishment after the two furious riders, and windows were thrown open, and heads thrust out to see what the unusual thunder of horses' hoofs at that early hour meant. George followed dauntlessly on, determined to do it or die in the attempt, and if he had ever heard of the Flying Dutchman, would undoubtedly have come to the conclusion that he was just then following his track on dry land. But, unlike the hapless Vanderdecken, Sir Norman came to a halt at last, and that so suddenly that his horse stood on his beam ends, and flourished his two forelimbs in the atmosphere. It was before La Masque's door, and Sir Norman was out of the saddle in a flash, and knocking like a postman with the handle of his whip on the door. The thundery reveille ran through the house, making it shake to its centre, and hurriedly brought to the door the anatomy who acted as guardian angel of the establishment. "La Masque is not at home, and I cannot admit you," was his sharp salute. "Then I shall just take the trouble of admitting myself," said Sir Norman, shortly, and without further ceremony he pushed aside the skeleton and entered. But that outraged servitor sprang in his path, indignant and amazed. "No, sir, I cannot permit it. I do not know you, and it is against all orders to admit strangers in La Masque's absence." "Bah, you old simpleton!" remarked Sir Norman, losing his customary respect for old age in his impatience. "I have La Masque's order for what I am about to do. Get along with you directly, will you? Show me to her private room, and no nonsense." He tapped his sword hilt significantly as he spoke, and that argument proved irresistible. Grumbling in low tones, the anatomist stalked upstairs, and the other followed, with very different feelings from those with which he had mounted that staircase last. His guide paused in the hall above, with his hand on the latch of a door. "This is her private room, is it?" demanded Sir Norman. "Yes." "Just stand aside, then, and let me pass." The room he entered was small, simply furnished, and seemed to answer as bed, chamber, and study all in one. There was a writing table under a window, covered with books, and he glanced at them with some curiosity. They were classics, Greek and Latin and other little known tongues, perhaps Sanskrit and Chaldaic, French belles letters, novels and poetry, and a few rare old English books. There were no papers, however, and those were what he was in search of. So spying a drawer in the table, he pulled it hastily open. The aid that met his eyes fairly dazzled him. It was full of jewels of incomparable beauty and value, strewn as carelessly about as if they were valueless. The blaze of gems at the midnight court seemed to him as nothing compared with the Golconda, the valley of diamonds shooting forth sparks of rainbow fire before him now. Around one magnificent diamond necklace was entwined a scrap of paper, on which was written, "The family jewels of the Montmorency, to be given to my sisters when I'm dead." That settled their destiny. All this blaze of diamonds, rubies, and opals were Leoline's, and, with the energetic rapidity characteristic of a young friend that morning, he swept them out on the table, and resumed his search for papers. No document was there to reward his search but the brief one twined round the necklace, and he was about giving up in despair, when a small brass light in one corner caught his eye. Instantly he was at it, trying it every way, shoving it out and in and up and down, until at last it yielded to his touch, disclosing an inner drawer full of papers and parchments. One glance showed them to be what he was in search of, proofs of Leoline and Hubert's identity, with the will of the Marquis, their father, and numerous other documents relative to his wealth and estates. These precious manuscripts he rolled together in a bundle, and placed carefully in his doublet, and then seizing a beautifully wrought brass casket that stood beneath the table, he swept the jewels in, secured it, and strapped it to his belt. This brisk and important little affair being over, he arose to go, and in turning saw the skeleton porter standing in the doorway, looking on in speechless dismay. "It's all right, my ancient friend," observed Sir Norman gravely. "These papers must go before the king, and these jewels to their proper owner." "Their proper owner!" repeated the old man, shrilly. "That is La Masque! Thief, robber, housebreaker, stop!" "My good old friend, you will do yourself a mischief if you bawl like that. Undoubtedly these things were La Masque's, but they are so no longer, since La Masque herself is among the things that were." "You shall not go!" yelled the old man, trembling with rage and anger. "Help! help! help!" "You noisy old idiot!" cried Sir Norman, losing all patience. "I will throw you out of the window if you keep up such a clamour as this. I tell you La Masque is dead." At this ominous announcement, the ghastly porter fell back, and became, if possible, a shade more ghastly than was his wont. "Dead and buried," repeated Sir Norman, with gloomy sternness. "And there will be somebody else coming to take possession shortly. How many more servants are there here beside yourself?" "Only one, sir. My wife Joanna." "In mercy's name, sir, do not turn us out in the streets at this dreadful time." "Not I. You and your wife Joanna may stagnate here till you blue mold for me, but keep the door fast, my good old friend. and admit no strangers, but those who can tell you that Masque is dead." With which parting piece of advice Sir Norman left the house and joined George, who sat like an effigy before the door, in a state of great mental wrath, and who accosted him rather suddenly the moment he made his appearance. "I tell you what, Sir Norman Kingsley, if you have many more morning calls to make, I shall beg leave to take my departure. As it is, I know we are behind time, and the Count, I mean, is not one who is accustomed or inclined to be kept waiting." "I am quite at your service now," said Sir Norman, springing on horseback, "so away with you, quick as you like." George wanted no second order. Before the words were well out of his companion's mouth, he was dashing away like a bolt from a bow, as furiously as if on a steeplechase, with Sir Norman close at his heels, and they rode, flushed and breathless, with their steeds all a-foaming, into the courtyard of the royal palace at Whitehall, just as the early rising sun was showing his florid and burning visage above the horizon. The courtyard, unlike the city streets, swarmed with busy life. Pages and attendants and soldiers, moving hither and thither, or lounging about, preparing for the morning's journey to Oxford. Among the rest, Sir Norman observed Hubert, lying very much at his ease wrapped in his cloak, on the ground, and chatting languidly with a pert and pretty attendant of the fair Mistress Stuart. He cut short his flirtation, however, abruptly enough, and sprang to his feet as he saw Sir Norman, while George immediately darted off and disappeared from the palace. "Am I late, Hubert?" said his hurried questioner, as he drew the lad's arm within his own and led him off out of hearing. "I think not." "The Count," said Hubert, with laughing emphasis, "has not been visible since he entered yonder doorway, and there has been no message that I have heard of. Doubtless, now that George has arrived, the message will soon be here, for the royal procession starts within half an hour. Are you sure there is no trick, Hubert? Even now he may be with Leoline." Hubert shrugged his shoulders. "He may be. We must take our chance for that. But we have his royal word to the contrary. Now that I have much faith in that," said Hubert. "If he were king of the world instead of only England," cried Sir Norman, with flashing eyes, "he shall not have Leoline while I wear a sword to defend her." "Regicide!" exclaimed Hubert, holding up both hands in affected horror. "Do my ears deceive me? Is this the loyal and chivalrous Sir Norman Kingsley, ready to die for king and country?" "Stuff and nonsense!" interrupted Sir Norman, impatiently. "I tell you, any one, be he whom he may, that attempts to take Leoline from me must reach her over my dead body." "Bravo! You ought to be a Frenchman, Sir Norman. And what if the lady herself, finding her dazzling suitor dropped his barnyard feathers, and soared over her head in his own eagle plumes, may not give you your dismissal, and usurp the place of pretty Madame Stuart?" "You cold-blooded young villain! If you insinuate such a thing again, I'll throttle you. Leoline loves me, and me alone." "Doubtless she thinks so, but she has yet to learn she has a king for a suitor." "Bah! You are nothing but a heartless cynic," said Sir Norman, yet with an anxious and irritated flush on his face too. "What do you know of love?" "More than you think, as pretty Marriott yonder could dispose, if put upon oath. But seriously, Sir Norman, I'm afraid your case is of the most desperate. Royal rivals are dangerous things." "Yet Charles has kind impulses, and has been known to do generous acts." "Has he? You expect him, beyond doubt, to do precisely as he said. And if Leoline, different from all the rest of her sex, prefers the knight to the king, he will yield her unresistingly to you." "I have nothing but his word for it," said Sir Norman, in a distracted tone, "and at present can do nothing but bide my time." "I have been thinking of that too. I promised, you know, when I left her last night, that we would return before day dawn and rescue her. The unhappy little beauty would doubtless think I have fallen into the tiger's jaws myself, and has half wept her bright eyes out by this time. My poor Leoline! And, oh Hubert, if you only knew what she is to you! I do know. She told me she was my sister." Sir Norman looked at him in amazement. "She told you? And you take it like this?" Certainly I take it like this. How would you have me take it? It is nothing to go into hysterics about after all." "Of all the cold-blooded young reptiles I ever saw," exclaimed Sir Norman, with infinite disgust, "you are the worst. If you were told you were to receive the crown of France to-morrow, you would probably open your eyes a trifle, and take it as you would a new cap." "Of course I would. I haven't lived in courts half my life to get up a scene for a small matter. Besides, I had an idea from the first moment I saw Leoline that she must be my sister, or something of that sort." "And so you felt no emotion whatever on hearing it?" "I don't know as I properly understand what you mean by emotion," said Hubert, reflectively. "But yes, I did feel somewhat pleased. She is so like me, and so uncommonly handsome." "Humph! There is a reason. Did she tell you how she discovered it herself?" "Let me see. No, I think not. She simply mentioned the fact." "She did not tell you either, I suppose, that you had more sisters than herself?" "More than herself? No, that would be a little too much of a good thing. One sister is quite enough for any reasonable mortal." "But there were two more, my good young friend." "Is it possible?" said Hubert, in a tone that betrayed not the slightest symptom of emotion. "Who are they?" Sir Norman paused one instant, combating a strong temptation to seize the phlegmatic page by the collar, and give him such another shaking as he would not get over for a week to come. But suddenly recollecting he was Leoline's brother, and by the same token a marquis or thereabouts, he merely paused to cast a withering look upon him, and walked on. "Well," said Hubert, "I'm waiting to be told." "You may wait, then," said Sir Norman, with a smothered growl, "and I give you joy when I tell you. Such extra communicativeness to one so stolid could do no good." "But I am not stolid. I am in a perfect agony of anxiety," said Hubert. "You young jackanapes!" said Sir Norman, half laughing, half incensed. "It were a wise steed, and a godly one, to take you by the hind leg and the nape of the neck, and pitch you over yonder wall. But for your mistress' sake I'll desist." "Which of them?" inquired Hubert, with provoking gravity. "It would be more to the point if you asked me who the others were, I think." "So I have, and you merely abused me for it. But I think I know one of them without being told. It is that other facsimile of Leoline and myself who died in the robber's ruin." "Exactly. You and she and Leoline were triplets." "And who is the other?" "Her name is La Masque. Have you ever heard it?" "La Masque! Nonsense!" exclaimed Hubert, with some energy in his voice at last. "You but jest, Sir Norman Kingsley." "No such thing. It is a positive fact. She told me the whole story herself." "And what is the whole story? And why did she not tell it to me instead of you?" "She told it to Leoline, thinking probably she had most sense, and she told it to me, as Leoline's future husband. It is somewhat long to relate, but it will help to beguile the time while we are waiting for the royal summons." And hereupon Sir Norman, without further preface, launched into a rapid resume of La Masque's story, feeling the cold chill with which he had witnessed it creep over him as he narrated her fearful end. "It struck me," concluded Sir Norman, "that it would be better to procure any papers she might possess at once, lest by accident they should fall into other hands. So I rode there directly, and, in spite of the cantankerous old porter, searched diligently until I found them. Here they are," said Sir Norman, drawing forth the roll. "And what do you intend doing with them?" inquired Hubert, glancing at the papers with an unmoved countenance. "Show them to the king, and, through his mediation with Louis, obtain for you the restoration of your rights." "And do you think his majesty will give himself so much trouble for the Earl of Rochester's page?" "I think he will take the trouble to see justice done, or at least he ought to. If he declines, we'll take the matter in our own hands, my Hubert, and you and I will seek Louis ourselves. Please God, the Earl of Rochester's page will yet wear the coronet of the Montmorency." "And the sister of a marquis will be no unworthy mate even for a Kingsley," said Hubert. "Has La Masque left nothing for her? Do you see this casket?" tapping the one of carved brass dangling from his belt. "Well, it is full of jewels worth a king's ransom. I found them in a drawer of La Masque's house, with directions that they were to be given to her sisters at her death. Miranda being dead, I presume they are all Leoline's now." "This is a queer business altogether," said Hubert, musingly, "and I am greatly mistaken if King Louis would not regard it as a very pretty little work of fiction. But I have proofs, lad. The authenticity of these papers cannot be doubted." "With all my heart. I have no objections to be made a marquis of, and go back to La Belle France, out of this land of plague and fog. Won't some of my friends here be astonished when they hear it, particularly the Earl of Rochester, when he finds out that he has had a marquis for a page? Ah, here comes George, and bearing a summons from Count L'Estrange at last." George approached, and intimated that Sir Norman was to follow him to the presence of his master. "Au revoir, then," said Hubert. "You will find me here when you come back." Sir Norman, with a slight tremor of the nerves at what was to come, followed the king's page through halls and ante-rooms full of loiterers, courtiers, and their attendants. Once a hand was laid on his shoulder, a laughing voice met his ear, and the Earl of Rochester stood beside him. "Good morning, Sir Norman. You are abroad betimes. How have you left your friend, the Count L'Estrange?" "Your lordship has probably seen him since I have, and should be able to answer that question best." "And how does his suit progress with the pretty Leoline?" went on the gay earl. "In faith, Kingsley, I never saw such a charming little beauty, and I shall do combat with you yet, with both the count and yourself, and outwit the pair of you. Permit me to differ from your lordship. Leoline will not touch you with a pair of tongs." "Ah, she has better taste than you give her credit for. But if I should fail, I know what to do to console myself." "May I ask what?" "Yes, there is Hubert, as like a two-piece in a pod. I shall dress him up in lace and silks and gewgaws, and have a Leoline of my own already made its order." "Permit me to doubt that too. Hubert is as much lost to you as Leoline." Leaving the volatile earl to put what construction pleased him best on this last sententious remark, he resumed his march after George, and was ushered at last into an anteroom near the audience chamber. Count L'Estrange, still attired as Count L'Estrange, stood near the window overlooking the courtyard, and as the page salaamed and withdrew, he turned around and greeted Sir Norman with his suavest air. "The appointed hour is past, Sir Norman Kingsley, but that is partly your own fault. Your guide hither tells me that you stopped for some time at the house of a fortune-teller, known as La Masque. Why was this?" "I was forced to stop on most important business," answered the knight, still resolved to treat him as the count, until it should please him to doff his incognito, "of which you shall hear anon. Just now, our business is with Leoline." "True, and as in a short time I start with yonder cavalcade, there is but little time to lose. Apropos, Kingsley, who is that mysterious woman, La Masque?" "She is, or was, for she is dead, sire, a French lady of noble birth, and her sister of Leoline." "Her sister! And have you discovered Leoline's history?" "I have." "And her name?" "And her name, she is Leoline de Montmorency, and with the proudest blood of France in her veins, living obscure and unknown, a stranger in a strange land since childhood. But with God's grace and your help, I hope to see her restored to all she has lost before long." "You know me, then?" said his companion, half smiling. "Yes, your majesty," answered Sir Norman, bowing low before the king. Chapter 22.
'23 of the Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Kaplan. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming, Chapter 23. As the last glimpse of moonlight and of Hubert's bright face vanished, Leoline took to pacing up and down the room in a most conflicting and excited state of mind. So many things had happened during the past night. So rapid and unprecedented had been the course of events. So changed had her whole life become within the last 12 hours, that when she came to think it all over, it fairly made her giddy. Dressing for her bridal, the terrible announcement of Prudence, the death-like swoon, the awakening at the plague pit, the maniac flight through the streets, the cold plunge in the river, her rescue, her interview with Sir Norman and her promise, the visit of La Masque, the appearance of the Count, her abduction, her journey here, coming of Hubert, and their suddenly discovered relationship. It was enough to stun anyone, and the end was not yet. Would Hubert effect his escape? Would they be able to free her? What place was this? And who was Count L'Estrange? It was a great deal easier to propound this catechism to herself than to find answers to her own questions, and so she walked up and down, worrying her pretty little head with all sorts of anxieties, until it was a perfect miracle that softening of the brain did not ensue. Her feet gave out sooner than her brain, though, and she got so tired before long that she dropped into a seat with a long-drawn, anxious sigh, and worn out with fatigue and watching, she at last fell asleep. And sleeping she dreamed. It seemed to her that the Count and Sir Norman were before her, in her chamber in the old house on London Bridge, tossing her heart between them like a sort of shuttlecock. By and by, with two things like two drumsticks, they began hammering away at the poor little fluttering heart, as if it were an anvil and they were a pair of blacksmiths, while the loud knocks upon it resounded through the room. For a time she was so bewildered that she could not comprehend what it meant, but at last she became conscious that someone was rapping at the door. Pressing one hand over her startled heart, she called, "Come in!" and the door opened, and George entered. "Count L'Estrange commands me to inform you, fair lady, that he will do himself the pleasure of visiting you immediately with Sir Norman Kingsley, if you are prepared to receive them." "With Sir Norman Kingsley?" repeated Leoline faintly. I'm afraid I do not quite understand." "Then you will be not much longer in that deplorable state," said George, backing out, "for here they are." "Pardon this intrusion, fairest Leoline," began the Count, "but Sir Norman and I are about to start on a journey, and before we go, there's a little difference of opinion between us that you are to settle." Leoline looked first at one and then at the other, utterly bewildered. "What is it?" she asked. "A simple matter enough. Last evening, if you recollect, you were my promised bride." "It was against my will," said Leoline boldly, though her voice shook. "You and Prudence made me." "Nay, Leoline, you wrong me. I, at least, need no compulsion." "You know better. You haunted me continually. You gave me no peace at all, and I would have just married you to get rid of you." "And you never loved me?" "I never did." "A frank confession. Did you then love anyone else?" The dark eyes fell, and the roseate glow again tinged the pearly face. "Mute," said the Count, with an almost imperceptible smile. "Look up, Leoline, and speak." But Leoline would do neither. Her momentary daring gone, she stood startled as a wild gazelle. "Shall I answer for her, Sir Count?" exclaimed Sir Norman, his own cheek dashed. "Leoline, Leoline, you love me!" Leoline was silent. "You are to decide between us, Leoline. Though the Count forcibly brought you here, he has been generous enough to grant this. Say, then, which of us you love best?" "I do not love him at all," said Leoline with a little disdain, "and he knows it." "Then it is I," said Sir Norman, his whole face beaming with delight. "It is you." But when Leoline turned the light of her beautiful eyes inquiringly upon him, he managed to remember it and announced that he had been sent by the king to usher her to the royal presence. Discarded. Clinging to her lover's arm, the girl grew white with undefined apprehension. Leisurely, the Count removed false wig, false eyebrows, false beard, and a face well known to Leoline from pictures and description turned full upon her. "Sire!" she cried in terror, crawling on her knees with clasped hands. "Nay, rise, fair Leoline," said the king, holding out his hand to assist her. "It is my place to kneel to one so lovely instead of having her kneel to me. Think again. Will you reject the king as you did the Count?" "Pardon, your majesty," said Leoline, scarcely daring to look up, "but I must." "So be it. You are a perfect miracle of troth and constancy, and I think I can afford to be generous for once. In 15 minutes we start for Oxford, and you must accompany us as Lady Kingsley. A hiring woman will wait upon you to robe you for your bridal. We will leave you now, and let me enjoin expedition." And while she stood too much astonished by the sudden proposal to answer, both were gone, and in their place stood a smiling lady's maid with a cloud of gossamer white in her arms. "Are those for me?" inquired Leoline, looking at them and trying to comprehend that it was real. "They are for you, sent by Mistress Stuart herself. Please sit down, and all will be ready in a trice." And in a trice all was ready. The shining jetty curls were smoothed and fell in a glossy shower, trained with jewels. The pearls Leoline herself still wore. The rose satin was discarded for another of bridal white, perfect of fit and splendid of feature. A great gossamer veil like a cloud of silver mist over all from head to foot, and Leoline was shown herself in a mirror, and in the sudden transformation could have exclaimed with the unfortunate lady in Brother Goose, shorn of her tresses when in balmy slumber, "As sure as I'm a little woman, this is none of it." But she it was, nevertheless, who stood listening like one in a trance to the enthusiastic praises of her waiting maid. Again there was a tap at the door. This time the attendant opened it, and George reappeared. Even he stood for a moment looking at the silver shining vision, so lost in admiration that he almost forgot his message. But when Leoline turned the light of her beautiful eyes inquiringly upon him, he managed to remember it, and announced that he had been sent by the king to usher her to the royal presence. With a fleet throbbing heart, flushed cheeks, and brilliant eyes, the dazzling bride followed him, unconscious that she had never looked so incomparably before in her life. It was but a few hours since she had dressed for another bridal, and what wonderful things had occurred since then. Her whole destiny had changed in a night. Not quite sure yet, but that she was still dreaming, she followed on, saw George throw open the great doors of the audience chamber, and found herself suddenly in what seemed to be to her a vast concourse of people. At the upper end of the apartment was a brilliant group of ladies, with the king's beautiful favorite in their midst, gossiping with knots of gentlemen. The king himself stood in the recess of a window, with his brother, the Duke of York, the Earl of Rochester, and Sir Norman Kingsley, and was laughing and relating animatedly to two peers the whole story. Leoline noticed this, and noticed, too, that all wore travelling dresses, most of the ladies, indeed, being attired in riding habits. The king himself advanced to her rescue, and drawing her arm within his, he led her up, and presented her to the fair Mistress Stuart, who received her with smiling graciousness, though Leoline, all unused to court ways, and aware of the lovely lady's questionable position, returned it almost with cold hauteur. Charles, being in an unusually gracious mood, only smiled as he noticed it, and introduced her next to his brother of York and her former short acquaintance, Rochester. "There's no need, I presume, to make you acquainted with this other gentleman," said Charles, with a laughing glance at Sir Norman. "Kingsley, stand forward and receive your bride. My Lord of Canterbury, we await your good offices." The bland bishop, in surplice and stole, and book in hand, stepped from a distant group and advanced. Sir Norman, with a flush on his cheek and an exultant light in his eyes, took the hand of his beautiful bride, who stood lovely and blushing and downcast, the envy and admiration of all. "Before the bishop now they stand, the bridegroom and the bride, and who shall paint what lovers feel in this their hour of pride? And who, indeed? Like many other pleasant things in this world, it requires to be felt to be appreciated, reason, it is a subject on which the unworthy chronicler is altogether incompetent to speak. The first words of the ceremony dropped from the prelate's urbane lips, and Sir Norman's heart danced a tarantella within him. "Wilt thou?" inquired the bishop blandly, and slipped a plain gold ring on one pretty finger of Leoline's hand, and all heard the old formula, "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder," and the whole mystic rite was over. Leoline gave one earnest glance at the ring on her finger. Long ago, slaves wore rings as the sign of their bondage. Is it for the same reason married women wear them now? While she yet looked half doubtfully at it, she was surrounded, congratulated, and stunned with a sudden clamor of voices, and then, through it all, she heard the well-remembered voice of Count L'Estrange saying, "My lords and ladies, time is on the wing, and the sun is already half an hour high. Off with you all to the courtyard, and mount, while Lady Kingsley changes her wedding gear for robes more befitting travel and joins us there." With a low obeisance to the king, the lovely bride hastened away after one of the favourite's attendants to do as he directed and don a riding suit. In 10 minutes after, when the royal cavalcade started, she turned from the pest-stricken city. True and fairest, where all was fair by Sir Norman's side, rode Leoline. Sitting one winter night by a glorious winter fire, while the snow and hail lashed the windows and the wind without roared like bottom, the weaver, a pleasant voice, whispered the foregoing tale. Here, as it paused abruptly, and seemed to have done with the whole thing, I naturally began to ask questions. What happened to the dwarf and his companions? What became of Hubert? Did Sir Norman and Lady Kingsley go to Devonshire, and did either of them die of the plague? I felt myself, when I said it, that the last suggestion was beneath contempt, and so a withering look from the face opposite proved. But the voice was obliging enough to answer the rest of my queries. The dwarf and his cronies being put into his Majesty's jail of Newgate, where the plague was raging fearfully, they all died in a week, and so managed to cheat the executioner. Hubert went to France and laid his claims before the royal Louis, who, not being able to do otherwise, was graciously pleased to acknowledge them. And Hubert became the Marquis de Montmorency, and in the fullness of time took unto himself a wife even of the daughters of the land, and lived happily forever after. And Sir Norman and Lady Kingsley did go to the old manor in Devonshire, where, with tradition and my informant, there is to be seen to this day an old family picture, painted some 12 years after, representing the knight and his lady sitting serenely in their ain ingle nook, with their family around them. Sir Norman, a little portlier, a little graver, in the serious dignity of pater familias, and Leoline, with the dark, beautiful eyes, the falling, shining hair, the sweet, smiling lips, and lovely, placid face of old. Between them, on 3 hassocks, sit 3 little boys, while the fourth and youngest, a miniature little Sir Norman, leans against his mother's shoulder and looks thoughtfully in her sweet, calm face. Of the fate of those 4, the same ancient lore affirms, that the eldest afterward bore the title of Earl of Kingsley, that the second became a Lord High Admiral, or Chancellor, or something equally highfalutin, and that the third became an Archbishop. But the highest honor of all was reserved for the fourth and youngest, continued the narrating voice, who, after many days, sailed for America, and in the course of time became President of the United States. Determined to be fully satisfied on this point, at least, the author invested all her spare change in a catalogue of all the said presidents, from George Washington to Chester A. Arthur, and, after a diligent and absorbing perusal of that piece of literature, could find no such name as Kingsley whatever, and has been forced to come to the conclusion that he must have applied to Congress to change his name on arriving in the New World, or else that her informant was laboring a falsehood when she told her so. As for the rest, I know not how the truth may be. I say it as 'twas said to me. End of chapter 23. Recording by Larry Kaplan. End of The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming.